Welcome to the Fantasy Rugby Draft podcast, Aviva Premiership edition. Thanks for downloading and listening. I'm Bruce Wilkinson, and joining me in the booth is our Northern Hemisphere correspondent, Kuchartown. How are you, sir?
Get some. I'm good. I'm glad to be here, and I have a title now too. That's very impressive sounding. Northern Hemisphere correspondent.
Yes. I was actually, my first question to you was going to be, did you remember your catchphrase?
Well, it's a good thing you put that on the rundown, because I had to actually think about it, truth be known. But there you go.
Last pod, I believe it was we were scratching our heads for what it was. I think we came up with 3 variations.
There's nothing like, having a catchphrase and not actually remembering it. It really shows, how the legs that the catchphrase has if you can't remember your own catchphrase.
That's right. It's Monday the 7th of August we're recording this. The man primarily made of moss is the voice you usually hear on the other end of the mic. He's furiously putting together some rankings on the site, as well as the Drafting 101 article that Kuchartown has written us, and also giving the site a bit of a spruce up. So that's why we got Kuchartown in here to chat about his Drafting 101 article. But firstly, though, for those who are the Super Rugby tuning in, hopefully, I suspect, waiting to see when our drafties are going to be, which is our Fantasy Rugby Draft Super Rugby Awards Gala for the year. We're going to hope to put something out in October, roughly about when the Aviva Premiership starts swinging into it, which kind of fits in with our usual timeliness. But as we don't quite have the same amount of knowledge of the Aviva Premiership as we do Super Rugby, I suspect there's quite a big gap. There's a steep learning curve for us, which is why we've gone to Kuchartown, and over the next few weeks, leading up to September 2 kickoff, we're going to see if we can get some of the North's finest minds on the podcast to analyse the teams. Kuchar, a wise man once said, if you are the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
I don't think anyone's ever said that about me, and that's when I'm standing in the room by myself also. So maybe I'm continually in the right room.
Well, that's right.
I'm never the smartest person in there.
That's right. You're in every room that you're supposed to be in. That's right.
That's right. Yeah, I know my level.
Water finds its level. So these include Alex Shaw, we're going to get on. He's played a little bit of Fantasy Rugby Draft before, and he writes for a lot of the Aviva, very knowledgeable chap. We're going to get some of the Egg Chaser lads, if you listen to their podcast, very amusing. Those guys have got some good knowledge as well on Aviva. We're going to have a chat to the UK Rugby Writer of the Year, Alan Dimmock, from Rugby World as well. Good chap. He's got a lot of background to the Aviva as well. And the Rugby Podcast chaps, so Ollie and Fred and Andy and those guys as well. So we hopefully have you covered, as well as Kuchartown can really pick up the baton for us in the north in terms of our pre-season help. And also the Rugby World podcast is going to do a bit of a segment as well in season around what's hot and what's not, and just have a bit of a chat around players you might want to pick up, players you might want to avoid, that type of thing. Just to give the listeners a bit of background first, though, Kuchartown, you've written the pre-season manifesto for pretty much every year, have you not?
I think so, yeah. Me and the Unabomber, both big on manifestos. And so, yeah, this will be, well, I guess is it 3 for Super Rugby, and now this one for the Aviva Premiership. So you would expect I'd be getting good at it by now, but I certainly cannot promise that.
No, look, I've had a read of it. I like it. I think it is one of your best work, some of your best work, if not the best work that you've done so far. I think it's got some real good value in there, some real good players and some good principles as well to try and pull out, and because it's a fairly new concept for a lot of those folks in the north, this draft concept. So it's kind of that right balance of giving you enough information for the experts who have done draft before and those that haven't.
Well, I'm nothing if not a man of principle, so I'm glad to hear that. And any sort of additional analysis I can give on the relative rankings of people with the last name Slade, I'm always happy to do that. So.
Indeed. In this podcast, we're going to discuss the article itself, and we're going to go and talk through a few little interesting names that you have on the list there, Kucha. But first of all, for those that are tuning in for the first time and are trying to get a little bit of a handle on what Fantasy Rugby Draft is, I thought we'd run through a few little tips and notes about the game since you've been playing for a wee bit and you've got a fair understanding on how the draft system works. People have been listening to my voice for a little bit long now. I was going to give you the first tip, but I'll go straight to you. What would you think is one of your top tips?
I would say you obviously want to draft well, so the first thing to do is to know when you are drafting. Don't plan a weekend away in Rome with your missus when you have one of your drafts, even though, it was Valentine's Day and, I'm nothing if not a romantic devil, that's for sure. And it was Italy playing in the Six Nations against England, so that was well and good. But I think there's no substitute for preparation going into a draft. I would say definitely do not just try and wing it, because it doesn't matter what your sort of preparation is, whether you just, you're a sort of a old school guy, you just write everything down on a piece of paper or print it out and highlight or have a spreadsheet or whatever, but you definitely need to have preparation, because things can change pretty quickly in a draft, and the time you get to draft, which I believe is, what do you normally start at 5 minutes, or is it 2?
Yeah, well, so that's a good point so you've raised. So an online draft, you get 90 seconds a pick, but if you want to do an offline one, then it's kind of dependent on what you kind of agree with a lot of our mates. And what do we usually do? We usually give it kind of 3 minutes for the first kind of 3 rounds or something like that, right, and then thin it right down.
Yeah, that's right. That sounds familiar. Yeah, I think the 90 seconds, given you're only picking one player, it seems like to talk about it in this context seems like an age, but let me tell you that 90 seconds can go by pretty quickly when you're on the clock, and particularly if the person in front of you picks quickly, and all of a sudden you sort of see your pick coming, and you think, well, I've got 3 minutes here because I've got my own 90 seconds and that person's 90 seconds, and all of a sudden they pick and the pressure's on you, and the old sphincter muscle starts to tighten, and things get a little bit hairy. So there's no substitute for preparation.
Yeah, and that's right. You raised a really good point, is having those rankings at hand, because a draft doesn't go to plan at all. You've got the best laid plans, but every draft is different, in so much as that everybody has different views on rugby players and different values and which way they want their team to go. And some of them have done preparation with mock drafts and bits and pieces, and some haven't. But invariably you'll find that players get taken in positions that you're just not expecting it to, and players will fall to you that you're just not expecting it to either. So at any one point in time, it's great to have rankings. And you don't need to get extensive. We rank about 170, 180 players on the site, so that if you do miss your pick, then you get a half-decent team at the end of it. But even if you just do, say, the top 10 at each position, at least that gives you a starting point to say, all right, I know what I'm going to do at any one point in time if stuff changes, if someone falls to me. That type of kind of dynamic happens a lot, and people bring their local bias into teams and into drafts as well. So, if we've talked about this quite frequently when you draft with, say, a few managers from South Africa, they're kind of liable to lean towards the name South African players, whereas if you draft with New Zealanders, they lean towards the New Zealanders. A good drafter or a good manager is someone who's team agnostic, in so much as it's just about the value of the player as opposed to any sort of hometown bias. But I wanted to just kind of backtrack a little bit. It's a funny little behind the scenes bit. So you mentioned that you're a bit of a romantic at heart, and you went to Rome with the missus to watch rugby.
Of course.
So Google gives us quite a bit of information about all of our users and who lands on the site and that type of stuff, and it's quite detailed stuff. And some of it's pretty interesting, some of it's just white noise to me, but it's useful for the marketing folks to have a look at. But what do you think second highest trait of a fantasy rugby draft person who landed on the site is? And by trait, the first one was rugby lover. Was the first one. What do you think the second trait might be, or behavioural kind of thing?
Divorced.
It's a pretty good guess, yeah. No.
Single, perhaps, would be another way to look at it.
Yeah, that's right. It was romantic movies.
Good Lord.
I know. And what I sat down and figured this out, right? So, not only are they avid rugby supporters and they're very fanatical, they're smart. So the way that they're placating the other half is by making sure that, I've got some rugby on tonight, I'll go and get a romantic movie out. What am I looking for? What do I send it to? What do I need to what do I need to download on Netflix? Give it to the missus, keep her occupied, and I'm going to go and watch Crusaders Stormers.
That's sound thinking. It is sound thinking.
It's joined up thinking. I'm not sure it's sound, but it's joined up.
Well, I think you could argue that at its core, Point Break is a romantic story because Utah ends up with the girl Laurie, I think her name was. Excuse me, at the end. He basically gets his partner killed. He doesn't catch the bad guy, and all this basically to get the girl in the end, who, she works in a frickin' greasy spoon sort of a thing. I mean, she's no great catch. Let's be fair.
Yeah, we're supposed to overlook that whole premise, right? That the bad guy won. Yeah,
he gets away, and even at the end, Utah is so deflated by he gets his man and then throws the badge away. He just throws his career in, and for all we know, Bodie might have paddled to New Zealand. I mean, Bodie was some kind of legend in my book. So, ultimately, I think you look at it, it's a romantic movie. So I can understand why the young ladies would be into a bit of Point Break.
Yeah, no, I thought it was fascinating. Bringing it back into draft a little bit. So I touched on it. There's the two types of drafts you can have. You can have an online draft, which is via the site. And that's, as I said, that's 90 seconds. Goes by pretty quickly. And that's a hell of a lot of fun. And typically what we see is that folks that are playing Fantasy Rugby Draft for the first season join a public online draft. And they kind of just figure out how it works. The little nuances that are rugby, kind of rugby tips and how to work the waiver wire, trading, just getting yourself in that draft, getting your feet under the table effectively. And then what happens is that in the second year, you'll find that they'll go and find 9 of their mates and they'll join a private league, and they'll do one offline as well. And you can make sure the commissioner just has to take a note of all of the picks that have happened, and then you can upload that to the site whenever you want to afterwards. So that's really where a lot of the fun is. The offline we really strenuously stress. Do you strenuously stress something? Does that?
I think by stressing it, you are doing it strenuously.
No, I thought so, right?
It might be it might be a bit redundant to use both.
And for users tuning in for the first time, you better get used to that as well. English isn't my first language, and I can't pronounce 95% of players' names, so you're gonna hear a lot of that and a lot of questioning my own. Is that how you're supposed to say that? But anyway, the offline draft is where we have a lot of the fun, and you go around to a mate's place or the rugby club or down the pub, and folks that aren't there, you Skype them in, and it's a great day. It's one of the first ones that I certainly get marked off in the calendar with the missus to make sure that we get the chicken wings in and the beers in. It's a great day.
And I think I touched upon this in the manifesto for this year's Super Rugby Draft. Every draft has to have its, well, we call it the Andy Dalton moment, and I'm not sure if we need to bore listeners with that, but whenever an incident in our NFL draft a few years ago where, long story short, Andy Dalton was taken, I believe, for the first overall pick by a chap who was proud as punch and thought he'd done really quite well. And, I mean, the whole room just fell about laughing. To this day, I cannot hear the name Andy Dalton, and it never fails to bring a smile to my face. So those are the sort of in-jokes, the bit of banter that every sort of league develops over its draft day and over the years. So that's the sort of, a fraternity, I suppose you could say, is a brotherhood. Might be overdoing it a little bit, but a fraternity sort of develops between those in your fantasy league.
Well, that's the thing, right? So they're a bit like, I was trying to talk to someone about fantasy rugby draft leagues, and they're kind of like banks, in that you don't change the personnel too much. So they're invariably folks that you either met like through university, even coming out of school, or your first job. So you're always going to go back to that time when you meet up for one time a year and tell the same jokes, hassle the same person for pulling Andy Dalton first overall, and et cetera, et cetera. And you go back to a time where you were kind of young and fancy free. And in my case, when you had hair, oh, actually we don't go that far back, but we go back quite far. But you touched on something there that's really good. It kind of does illustrate one of the key points as well in drafting versus a salary cap model, in that Andy Dalton example. So it wasn't that Andy Dalton's a bad player. He might well have gone on to be the first, the number one quarterback in the league, and he might have been an absolute barnstormer. The point being, he didn't have to draft them one overall. He probably could have waited to about in our league, it probably was down about 10 or 11 round, I think it might have been at that point. He wasn't particularly a superstar, and the point being that everything is value-based. So even if you think someone is going to have an outstanding season, you still have to evaluate which round do you think he's going to go in, because it doesn't make sense to, say, pull him in the first round and then when you could have done it, say, in the sixth round. So you just need to be aware of each individual's player's value and where they may land in your draft. And you have to be a little bit clever about it as well. We put the rankings on the site, so we have a bit of a summit that we sit down and go through all the players. We rank the positions, and then we put them in an overall bucket, just to kind of toss up the various positions when we're faced with the decision in the first or second round. And what we like to do is be able to call on that at any one point in time. So we really encourage you to do that. So value-based drafting is something that's quite important, and it's a quite important theme that you don't see in the salary cap side of things.
No, absolutely, and I think that's where some of the biggest mistakes are made. And on the flip side, I guess the flip side of that, it always makes me laugh when the New England Patriots get all the credit in the world for drafting Tom Brady in the 6th round. It's like, if they thought this guy was going to be the greatest quarterback of all time, they would have drafted him in the 1st round. Or drafted him, they wouldn't have left it to the 6th round where they just sort of, he was just a bit of an add-on. But, it goes to show relative value at the time. And going into a season, one player, may be ranked significantly higher and they just have a crap season. It doesn't necessarily make it a bad draft pick, because with the intel you had at the time, you thought it wasn't a bad bet taking that person in the 1st round or 2nd round. So everything is relative.
Yeah, and know your managers. So as I said, we do these rankings. Use those as a bit of a guide, as a starting point, because invariably people will kind of look to those to say, okay, I've got this pick coming up. What does the site say I should do, or what do they look at? And roughly that'll be when the player goes. But you need to overlay that with who in your group. So if you're drafting with a bunch of Wasps fans, for instance, then you're probably going to see Christian Wade go a lot higher, Kurtley Beale go a lot higher, Rob Miller, Willie LaRue, these types of players, they're going to go a lot higher, because it is nice to own, to have that perfect storm, which is a successful fantasy rugby draft player, and also a little bit of local bias. So, for instance, I'm a Crusaders fan, and I didn't overdraft, but I drafted Ndolo in about 3 of my teams this season, and it's great to have both. But I wouldn't say that that's an advisable theory. In fact, I'd advise against it most of the time. But if you're going with Wasps fan, then you know that certain players are going to be rising, and if you did actually think they were going to be superstars, then you're going to have to grab them quite early as well. And one other point I just wanted to say, so just with the draft in general, so the way that it works is the site will randomize the order if you're doing an online draft. For an offline one, you can just pull it out of the hat and change the names around in the spreadsheet and then upload it to the site, and it'll upload 1 through 10. But the way that it works is via a snake draft. So it randomizes 1 through 10, and then the 11th pick is the person who did the 10th pick. So it's snakes. And then it goes back to the person at number 1. So the person who drafted overall at number 1 gets the 20th pick. So sometimes it's great to have the first pick because you get a really a stud player. But other times it actually might be quite useful to get that 10th pick, because you can build a really solid team with two picks there at the swing picks at 10 or 11. What else you got, Cooch?
Well, just a point that you were talking about, the being in the draft and a Wasps player, or excuse me, a Wasps fan drafting Wasps players and that sort of thing. On the flip side of that also, you know, it is always nice to have guys that you are genuinely cheering for in the team that you support. Mm-hmm. It can feel a little bit dirty at times when, you know, for me, Christian Wade, if he was in my team, if he scored a try, I'd feel dirty, but I'm, you know, because I'd be happy.
Yep.
You know, like, well, yep. I can't stand, I don't like Wasps, and if he scores, obviously that's Wasps going to do well, and particularly if they're playing Quins, who I support, you're not particularly happy in the state of the game itself, but for your fantasy team, you're kind of like, I can live with that, but it does feel a little bit dirty. No, and also in the draft, another thing I think, you know, you need to keep an eye on is you get a run on players or run on positions, more to the point. So, you know, whoever the first person is to break the seal on, generally speaking, people select fly halves and outside backs at the top of a draft, and if someone sort of goes for a midfielder, that sort of breaks the seal, and everyone else swings in on midfielders, and then the same on sort of down the line. So that's also something to keep an eye out for.
Yep, no, it's a great call. I think they say that zig when you're zagging and zag when you're zigging, right? Sometimes you're not advised to get the bottom of a tier when you've got the next stud player at the position, especially early on. Right, that's probably all the kind of general advice at the moment. If you did want to have any questions at all, then just fire us through on social on Fantasy Rug Draft, or drop us a mail at support@fantasyrugbydraft.com, and we'll set you right. It's at this point we're going to split the podcast in two. The second half ran over a little bit, going through Kuch's Drafting 101 article. There was quite a lot of detail to get through, so we felt it probably makes sense to split this into two. But the first half gives you quite a good intro to Fantasy Rugby Draft, gives you a little bit of tips on what to look out for and things to be aware of in Fantasy Rugby Draft, and how to go about your draft. If you want to catch a little bit more detail around Kuch's Drafting 101 article and specific players that we call out, then check out for that in the next couple of days as well. Thanks for downloading and listening. My name's Bruce Wilkinson. Out to your